So there you are, you're 3 years old, living on a remote Scottish island in fairly, it has to be said, I've visited Barn Hill, and it is 8 miles from anywhere, isn't it? The road stops 8 miles before you get to Barn Hill. The nearest shop is what, 17 miles away?
No, it's about 25.
25, that's right, yeah. Do you think, I mean, was this actually ideal terrain to bring up a 3-year-old?
As terrain for a 3-year-old, it was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was a great place. I had no yardstick to judge it by, because being an only child, I hadn't been playing with many children up to that age. And of course, when we lived on this remote farmhouse called Barn Hill, the world was my oyster. I could go anywhere I liked. I mean, there was thousands of acres that you could have walked over, and nobody really bothered too much as long as I turned up, back again for meals. I was allowed to do pretty much what I liked.
But then there were incidental dangers, weren't there? This is a letter that written by your father to Anthony Pole from Barn Hill, dated the 8th of September 1947, and he said, "Recently, 4 of us, including Richard, you would have been 3, were all but drowned in the famous whirlpool of Corryvreckan. There was a very incorrect account of the disaster in the Daily Express. It was very unpleasant while it lasted, and it ended by our being literally wrecked on a desert island where we might have been stranded for a day or 2, but very luckily some lobster fishermen saw the fire we lit for a signal and got us off. Richard loved every moment of it, except when he was actually in the water. He was getting enormous and talking a good deal more. He had a bad fall earlier in the year and scarred his forehead, but I imagine the scar will disappear after a year or 2. Now, do you remember the whirlpool? Tell us about
Oh, yes, well...
He misread the timetables, didn't he?
Yes, but we'd spent a lovely weekend on the west coast of Jura, a place called Glengarrisdale, which had a little bothy. And we'd had a great time, and obviously come Sunday afternoon we had to go back to Barn Hill, because at that time we were making hay. And so my father, myself, and 2 of his niece and nephew decided we'd have to go back round through this strait called the Gulf of Corryvreckan, which is notorious because it has a very, very powerful tidal stream running through it. If anybody in here who sails might actually know it. But so we set off, and of course he misread the timetable. It's quite easy so to do. And we arrived in the strait, into the Gulf, and the tide was still running quite smartly. I can't remember which way it was going, but it was probably on the flood, so it was heading out to sea. And the poor old outboard got swamped, and so Henry, my cousin, had to take to the oars, and my father said, "Come on, Henry, we'll have to pull for the nearest island." There is an island, just a couple of little islands in the slightly off centre. So we headed for that, and Henry jumped off, took the painter, the mooring line, jumped onto the rocks, and of course out there you've always got a very heavy swell coming in from the Atlantic, and the swell simply took the dinghy up the rocks and receded and left the dinghy high and dry, with us still in it, and of course it simply rolled back upside down, and into the sea we all went. Up to that point, I thought the whole thing was great fun. Up, down, splish, splosh, I believe was what the words I used. I imagine the smile disappeared smartly off my face when I found myself underneath the dinghy and in the water. So my father grabbed me, pulled me out, I think by the knee or something like that, and we scrambled ashore. Now, it's quite interesting. You might say, well, it was a silly accident. But of course, the trouble is, silly accidents can turn very, very quickly into an absolute tragedy. And one has to remember that the tide was actually running past the rock that we were stranded on. It was a small island, sort of half an acre or so. And there's heavy overfalls. It's a very, very dangerous place, is the Gulf of Corryvreckan. Unless you know what you're doing, it'll turn around and bite you. So anyway, we scrambled ashore, and obviously soaking wet. We'd lost everything, because the dinghy having turned upside down, the outboard disappeared, the oars disappeared, the blankets that we had for the weekend disappeared, the whole lot. So, but we came ashore, and somehow my father got a fire going. I don't know how, he must have dried his lighter out.
So the lobster boat came round.
Well, yes, but they found a potato.
He went off to search for bird's eggs, didn't he?
Yes,
he didn't like to take them.
No, but he did find a potato.
He found some gull's eggs.
Yes, yeah. Well, yeah, he was quite welcome to them, actually. I've had gull's eggs. I can't say I'm overfond. But anyway, yes, eventually, a lobster fisherman, 2 lobster fishermen came through in their boat about 2 hours later, and saw us on the island. We waved, and they came over and took us off. And my father said, "Look, just take us around the corner to the farmhouse above Barn Hill, which is about a mile from where we were, or rather from Barn Hill." And we went ashore, and we simply walked down the track back to Barn Hill, where we were greeted with, "Where have you been?"
You were greeted with "Where have you been" by your Aunt Amber?
Yes, and my father said, "Well, actually, we've been shipwrecked."
There was
left it at that.
There was a point, wasn't there, during the early part of the Barn Hill sojourn, where your father's housekeeper, Susan Watson, had come up to look after you, but his sister Avril was there as well, and the two, there was a certain amount of tension between the two of them.
There was, yes. Avril, my aunt, or his sister, had been asked by my father to come up to Barn Hill to run the house and generally look after him. And I have to say here now that without her, I don't think my father could ever have survived on Jura, certainly not on his own. She was the absolute mainstay of the household. But she certainly, somehow, she didn't like poor Susan Watson, whom I was very fond of, because she had looked after me in Canonbury Square, was unfortunately slightly disabled, and she didn't walk very well. And if you have to be fully fit to live on someone like Jura. And anyway, I think the problem was that she wanted to call him George, and Avril said, "No, his name is Eric."
Which, of course, he disliked as a name.
Well, yes, okay. The problem was, of course, he had all his sort of pre-fame friends who called him Eric, and of course the people who had read anything of him, of course, immediately called him George.
It has to be said, there's a wonderful account, it actually in an unpublished novel by a man called David Holbrook, who was Susan Watson's boyfriend, who came up to visit her, where he describes the two of them sitting. I mean, he didn't. It has to be said that he didn't particularly get on with your father. But there's this marvellous account of Eric and Avril sitting by the fire in the farmhouse as the rain fell. Avril plucking a goose. That's right. And talking in sort of monosyllabically about the weather. And he thought this was so gloomy that I think the two of them actually escaped from the island. Did he not take her away after a...
Well, I think... I don't remember the actual occasion, but certainly Susan didn't survive very long there. And she was given her marching orders by Avril, I think. I think she realised that she was competing against somebody who was not going to give in.
Too tough
for her. And,
so there you are. You're 4 years old, living on this remote island with your father, who's seriously ill but struggling, almost literally killing himself to write this book. And the accounts of the last winter in which he typed up the final version of 1984 are quite extraordinary, because he locked himself up in the bedroom, didn't he, with chain-smoking Captain Full Strength, with a defective paraffin heater pulsing out these... As a boy of 3 and 4, were you conscious that he wasn't at all well and was exacerbating this ill health by the way in which he was driving himself?
No, I probably wasn't aware of his illness, in the sense that I was aware that he would disappear off, he would go and work. In fact, of course, it wasn't Captain Full Strength he smoked. It was roll-up tobacco. Oh, yes, very often in a newspaper. And God, no wonder it killed him. Dear Lord. I know, because I tried.
That's it, yes. Perhaps you'd like to tell. Yes, there's a famous story about your experimenting with tobacco.
I'd found an old pipe in the garden, and so after lunch, I went into the fireplace where he threw all his cigarette ends, and I took the tobacco out of the paper, stuffed it into the pipe, and then proceeded to ask for a light. And the conversation, there was no break in the conversation around the table. His hand just simply went into his pocket, took out the lighter, and went round his back and handed it to me with no further comment. I didn't succeed in getting it going, unfortunately, at that particular moment, but I did later on that afternoon, to the obvious obvious result, of course.
What happened?
Violently sick, as one usually is. I did persevere later on, actually, when I went to school and mastered the trick of smoking, but I've since given up many years ago.